Hi, and welcome to Boldmethod Live VFR. I'm Alex Udris, and tonight we're going to talk about night operations. And it's pretty timely. Sunset's starting to move earlier and earlier. We're getting into the late fall and soon to be winter months. And so night operations become more and more regular. And tonight we're going to talk about the regs behind night operations. There's three kind of different times that you need to know and when each one's important. And then we're going to talk through some of the different illusions that you can get at night. All the things that make landing and operating at night a little bit more difficult. Colin Cutler is our technical director tonight. He's also managing chat, and the entire point is to be interactive. So as we're going through the presentation tonight, if I lose you, if you want me to go into more depth, if you have a question, please throw it out in chat, and then Colin will work them into our presentation. We'll go from there. So, as I said, we're going to start with regulations because everybody loves regs. They're always the most exciting. And talk about the three major times. And then from there, we're going to roll into night illusions. And we've got footage, a lot of it from our landings course, that shows all those different illusions. So, let's start with the three different time periods you need to know. And we'll jump to the iPad. Okay. So, when we look at night operations, there are really three different times that become important. The first one is sunset to sunrise, or sunrise. At sunset to sunrise, you have to have your position lights on. And those are the red, green, and white nav lights, you typically call them. A lot of switches call them nav lights, but the technical term is position lights. And if you're equipped with anti-collision lights, if your aircraft's required to have them and you're equipped with them, they need to be lighted as well. The second time, the end of evening civil twilight to the beginning of morning civil twilight. That's when you can actually log night flight time, and your plane needs to be night equipped. So when we talk about night equipment, we're usually talking about flaps, fuses. So you either need a complete set or three of each type, and that only applies to fuses that are accessible to the pilot in the cockpit. Most modern aircraft don't use fuses. The only fuses you'll find are in avionics bays or the engine compartment, which are not accessible to the pilot. But that's the F. L, landing light if you're operating for hire. If you're not operating for hire, you do not need a landing light. A, typically we say alternator. What we're really talking about is a source of continuous power. Just a little battery doesn't cut it. You need a continuous source of power that could last throughout a flight. To power any of your electrical equipment. P is those position lights, and then S is strobes. Those anti-collision lights are required. The funny thing about strobes, when you start talking about aircraft that are made after 1996, strobes are essentially always required, or anti-collision lights are always required. For aircraft manufactured earlier, most of them now are equipped with anti-collision lights, and so even though we still keep including them on night operations, the reality is most aircraft are now equipped with them. They need to be operated anytime you're flying. And if they break, you can continue to a point where you can get them repaired. But other than that, they need to be lighted. Okay, we'll jump back to the iPad. The third time is what we call night currency. An hour after sunset, ending an hour before sunrise. That's when you need that night landing currency, and it's only required to carry passengers. So if you're only operating with flight crew, and we'll talk about that in a second, you don't need to technically be night current. Okay, so let's talk about sunset to sunrise. This is the FAR where we go over it. It's FAR 91.209. And it says no person, I'll highlight it as we go here, so just give me 1 second. Okay, so during the period of sunset to sunrise, or in Alaska I'll underline, during the period a prominent unlighted object cannot be seen from a distance of 3 statute miles, or the sun is more than 6 degrees below the horizon. You cannot operate an aircraft unless it has lighted position lights. Park or move an aircraft in or in dangerous proximity to a night flight operations area of an airport unless the aircraft is clearly illuminated, has lighted position lights, or is in an area that is marked by obstruction lights. So essentially what they're saying there, let's say you're moving an aircraft, relocating it from one end of a ramp to another, and your aircraft doesn't have operating position lights. As long as the area is either marked out by obstruction lights or the ramp itself is clearly illuminated, you could still relocate the airplane. but that does not actually let you fly the airplane. And then the third section requires airplanes on water to have anchor lights. Okay, and then the second one, B, you can see down here. I gotta switch over. You cannot operate an aircraft that is equipped with an anti-collision light system unless it has lighted anti-collision lights. Typically, people call these strobes. However, the anti-collision lights need not be lighted when the PIC determines that because of operating conditions, it would be in the interest of safety to turn the lights off. So let's talk about that one in depth for a second. So we know sunset to sunrise, position lights or nav lights, they need to be on. And for me, if I know I'm even operating into sunset or sunrise, I'll flip them on right away, especially with LED lights. They don't really burn out anymore, so that's not really a concern. And with a lot of LED systems, you could just leave them lit anytime you're flying day or night. When we start talking about anti-collision lights, if we think that using them is unsafe, we can turn them off. So what kind of conditions are we talking about? One of the biggest ones is taxiing. And the reason for that is because those bright lights, when they reflect off of the pavement, can start to blind the pilot. They could actually kind of give you a little bit of vertigo sometimes, and they can blind other pilots that are taxiing by you. So typically, when we're operating on the ground at an airport, I'll leave my strobe or my anti-collision lights off. As part of my taxi on checklist, when I taxi onto the runway, I'll flip my strobes on. But here's the problem. You know, as pilots, we always like to talk about checklist discipline. I think you start learning it from day one, and every manufacturer, every operator seems to have a little bit different checklist, but one thing always seems to be true, and that is your before takeoff checklist happens before you're cleared by air traffic control onto that runway. I mean, normally you're running that checklist in a run-up area. You still may have a taxi to the runway, or you're going to be sitting there on a taxiway waiting for clearance for a while, or waiting for other aircraft at non-towered airports to land. So you kind of really have this gap where you might set up your strobe lights or your nav lights or other lights on an earlier checklist. You defer your strobe lights, then you pull up to the runway, you get cleared, and you go for takeoff, and it's easy to forget them in the off position. And so one of the things that I always tell people is develop a pre-taxi on check specifically for your airplane to confirm that some of the items you might defer are done so that you don't forget those. So in the Cirrus and the SR22 Turbo, I typically leave my mixture leaned after my run-up's complete. So I'll move it to rich, conduct my run-up because it's turbocharged, and then I'll bring it back to lean to prevent me from fouling my spark plugs. And then if I have to sit, and wait for ATC to clear me on a runway, I'm not fouling the plugs, but you could easily forget and take off with that mixture leaned. And in a turbo, you'd quickly overheat the engine. So for me, my quick pre-takeoff check, I check to make sure my mixture is full rich, that my flaps are set for takeoff. We have air conditioner, so I make sure my recirculation is off. That can push carbon monoxide into the cockpit if it's left on. And then I go over and I make sure both my pitot heat and my strobes are on. I fly with the pitot heat on all of the time, but pitot heat and strobes. And from there, we've got a takeoff, go around, flight command button, we hit that. That's a checklist I do all of the time. And that way, if I keep my anti-collision lights off at night, I skip them in a checklist earlier, I make sure I remember to turn them on once I get on the runway. Okay, looks like we got our first question.
Okay, first question is from Roslyn, and it goes back to the landing light and the for hire that you were talking about just a little bit ago. The question is this: is flight instruction considered for hire?
I believe it is. So for flight instruction, you would need a landing light. Colin, am I right on that?
I think you're right.
Yeah. Yep. Flight instruction is considered operating for hire if the CFI provides the aircraft. That's a caveat. If you own your own airplane, then the aircraft is not operated for hire. If the flight school is providing the aircraft to you, then the aircraft is operated for hire. And in that case, you would actually need a landing light. And one of the things we used to do, especially at UND, and I do occasionally now just for proficiency, is I will practice a landing lights off landing, where I just use the runway lights. I keep my aircraft's landing lights turned off. And again, it's a good thing to practice, but if the school is providing the airplane, then you need a landing light. One last thing I'm going to touch on with night strobes. We don't think about it a lot unless you're an instrument-rated pilot, but at night, if you're flying through snow or clouds or fog, smoke, heavy haze, the anti-collision lights can actually flood the cockpit. So if I'm in IMC, or if I start to see the anti-collision lights from my wingtips, we have white ones, start to reflect back into the cockpit, I'll turn them off until I'm back in clear air, and then I'll turn them back on. You know, again, one of the keys, anytime you turn something like that off, is remembering that it's off and remembering to turn it back on. So I'll note it on my knee board to know that they're off, so that if I go down and get ATIS on arrival, I can see that I have those turned off. Okay, let's take a look. Position lights are a funny thing because we always learn where they are in the airplane, but believe it or not, I've met pilots with thousands of hours who still sometimes forget. And it's because red, which starts with an R, is actually on the left wing. You've got your red light on the left wing. You've got your green light on the right wing. The white lights need to be seen from behind. And so on some aircraft, you'll find them shielded on the tips of the wings, so they only point backwards, so that you get two whites here, like on a Cirrus. On other aircraft, they're going to be on the tail, pointing back, and you'll see some with all three. So one of the things I tell people, if it's red, it means it's passing from the right. If you see a red light at night in front of you, and it's moving, that means that it's passing from the right to your left. Again, it's something we don't really think about very often, but it is absolutely something that you need to know. The other thing that I always tell people is check the lights after maintenance. If you've ever had maintenance done on the airplane, if they've replaced bulbs, there's always a chance that that could be done in the wrong order. So you want to make sure that those lights are actually on the correct side. Okay, next definition here is civil twilight. And this is when you actually need night equipment. And if you look at it, the FAA doesn't define it, but the US Navy does. Night means a time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight, as published in the Air Almanac and converted to local time. So you could look at the Air Almanac. Of course, the US Navy's definition for civil twilight is defined to begin in the morning and to end in the evening when the center of the sun is geometrically 6 degrees below the horizon. So when we're talking about civil twilight, it's not when the sun's set, but when the center of the sun has dropped another 6 degrees. And we tend to say that's about 30 minutes. And that's because the sun moves through the sky at a rate of about 15 degrees per hour. So if you think about that, 6 degrees is roughly half of 15. It's a little less than that. So people oftentimes say 30 minutes after sunset, that's civil twilight. It's actually a little less. And you can find that, ForeFlight will tell it to you on an airport page. You can usually find it on any weather. Like if you're using WeatherBug or Wonderground or any of those systems, they'll typically tell you what time sunset is, and then you can add about 20 minutes, and I would say that's probably a good time to consider civil twilight. The interesting thing when we're talking about sunset and civil twilight is you do not need to be night current to fly at either of these times. At civil twilight, you can start logging night time, okay? But you don't actually need to be night current. And so that really starts to confuse people because night currency isn't required at night. Night currency is required between the time of an hour after sunset to an hour before sunrise. So nights actually started about 30 minutes before night currency is required. And night actually ends about 30 minutes after you can log night currency in the morning. So if let's say you're not night current and you're taking a cross-country flight, you're going from somewhere during the day and you land, let's say 20 minutes after sunset, you could log 0.4, let's say, of nighttime without being current, and you're totally legal. And that's something that confuses people. But again, it's a completely different time. Okay, so let's take a look at the currency requirement. And the key thing to remember here is it follows a completely different time rule. An hour after sunset to an hour before sunrise, FAR 61.57b. The key thing here, no person may act as PIC of an aircraft carrying passengers. So that's something we'll talk about in a second. During the period between an hour after sunset and an hour before sunrise, unless within the preceding 90 days the person has made at least 3 takeoffs and 3 landings, to a full stop during the period of an hour after sunset and ending an hour before sunrise. Okay, so 3 takeoffs and 3 landings. And that person has acted as sole manipulator of the flight controls, and the required takeoffs and landings are performed in an aircraft of the same category, class, and if a type rating is required, type. And if the aircraft to be flown is an airplane with a tail wheel, the takeoff and landings must have been made to a full stop in an airplane with a tail wheel. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Okay, so this question is perfectly timed with what you just went through. The question is this. Can 2 pilots that are not night current fly together at night and do the 3 takeoffs and landings each, or is the other pilot considered a passenger?
So that's a great question, and it comes down to what is a crew member? Okay, that's possibly one of the more confusing parts when we're learning how to fly. What's a crew member? And the answer is it depends on the kind of operation that you're doing and whether that person is required. So 2 pilots flying an airplane together, let's say it's a Cessna 172. 1 pilot is a crew member and 1 pilot is a passenger. And that's because a Cessna 172 only requires 1 pilot to operate the aircraft. If you are operating under Part 135 in an airplane like a PC-12 that only requires 1 crew member, PC-12, Pilatus PC-12 single engine turboprop, can be flown by 1 pilot. But let's say your operation specifications require 2 crew members on that Part 135 operation. Now, both pilots are considered crew members. There's 2 people in there. So the question is, are you required to be in the airplane either by the airplane certification, does it require more than 1 pilot, or are you required to be in the airplane under regulations? So for most of us operating under Part 91, okay, the reality is there's only a few cases in single engine and light twin engine airplanes where you would ever legally be able to have another crew member in that airplane. One of which is a safety pilot. When you're working on simulated instrument flight, you don't have to have an instrument rating to simulate instrument flight. A private pilot can go up there and practice. The other safety pilot is a required flight crew member. So during those times, the operation requires 2 crew members. Now, if you're landing at night with a safety pilot, you're generally not landing under the hood. You're looking out, the instrument flight is done. So as soon as you start looking back outside, that safety pilot is no longer a required crew member. They now become a passenger. They can't log any of that flight time. So if you're flying around with a safety pilot, practicing simulated instrument work at night, once you try to land, they're a passenger again. You need to be night current. The next case is when you have an instructor and a student flying together. So I'm a CFI. Let's say I've let my night currency lapse, and I'm going to go fly with Colin. We're going to do some practice night landings. Both of us are required flight crew members because you can't teach without a student. You can't learn without, you can learn without an instructor, but you can't get flight instruction without an instructor. So we're both considered required flight crew members. And so flight instructors and their students do not need to be night or day current. They're considered crew members. Now, put an observer in the back seat, another student pilot or a commercial pilot, now you've got a passenger, and the pilot in command would need to be night current, like the flight instructor. Okay, looks like we got another question.
You kind of answered it, but I just wanted to throw it out here, and it was actually more of a statement than a question in here, but I thought it was a good point. And the question is this: can 2 unnight current CFIs get night current together?
So the reality is, sure, absolutely. The question is, if there was an accident or an incident, the FAA would really ask, was this flight instruction, or were you just calling it flight instruction so that you could both climb into the airplane and kind of get away from the rule? And so, you know, for example, let's say Colin doesn't fly for a while. He breaks his leg, and he's out of flying for 90 days, and he comes back and he's like, hey, I want to do some night practice with you. And I've lapsed night currency. Sure, we're both CFIs legally. Yes, I can go up and give call-in instruction at night without being current. However, I always tell people to be careful because if you're not really providing instruction and you're not logging as an instruction and you're both not current and something happens, the FAA can always come back and say, hey, this really doesn't look like it was instruction. It looks like you're not following the intent of the regulation. The intent is that if there's a passenger in the airplane and that person's not providing a crew member role, you need to be night current. Okay, one other thing to think about with night currency, and this starts to happen as you do more and more cross-country operations, especially under Part 91. Oftentimes, I will take off during the day and I'll land at night. I don't know if you follow our Instagram account, but we did a trip to Santa Fe a couple weeks ago and took off in the middle of the day, landed at night. And so I can count one landing towards night currency, but I never got a takeoff. And that's something to watch when you're looking at your night currency. You can end up in a scenario where you're flying a lot across countries, you're taking off for the day, landing at night, you go back and you see, hey, okay, in the last 90 days, I got like 10 night landings. But how many night takeoffs do you have? If you don't have any night takeoffs, then you're not night current. That's a problem I've had before where I've ended up looking at my logbook and I've got like 15 night landings, but no night takeoffs, and I'm in the pattern of Metro. I didn't even need the landings. I just needed the 3 takeoffs to get myself back to night currency. So it's takeoffs and landings. Okay, I know that's one that you can kind of beat to death, but the reality is it's something that confuses people all of the time. And as you really start getting out there operating, especially if you're doing cross countries, you're kind of just flying regularly, even as an airline pilot, then you go out under Part 91 and you fly. Now all of a sudden you got to keep track of all those nuances. Okay, so let's get from there into some of the night illusions. Once you're legally equipped and ready to fly, just keep in the airplane in the air can sometimes be a little bit of a difficult experience. And I know I'm an instrument rated pilot. I've operated in IFR quite a bit, actual IFR quite a bit, flown approaches. And at the end of the day, a moonless, pitch black light or night over New Mexico or Wyoming is almost worse than IMC. IMC at least has some light coming into the cockpit through the clouds, but a moonless, pitch black night where there's really no ground reference can be almost worse than flying in hard IMC. So I always tell people when we're talking about night operations, it's really learning to set minimums and understand the kind of errors and illusions that we're going to see once we get out there. And a lot of it comes down to your eyes. So let's start with a quick refresher on how your eyes work, and then we'll go from there. So let's go back to the iPad. This is the front. Here's your pupil. That is a very blue eye, and your optic nerve in the back. Believe it or not, right here you do have a small blind spot, and that's caused by the fact that there are no rods and cones on that optic nerve. But when you have both eyes working, that cancels itself out. The actual vision is done by 2 different things. One is cones, receptors, and another set is rods. So cones are what we think about typically during the day, though we're always using cones and rods together. Cones provide your focal vision. They are not as light sensitive and they can see color. So, when you're reading or scanning, you're predominantly using those cones. But then around the periphery, you have rods. These are much more light sensitive, but they really see in black and white, and they take a significant amount of time to adjust to night. And because they're not towards the center of your eyeball, they're used more for peripheral vision. So one of the things that we talk about at night is scanning. Your scan pattern is a little bit different at night than it is during the day. During the day, we're scanning, look at an area, you're kind of focusing on it, moving your eyes to the next area to the next. At night, those cones don't get quite enough light to really be able to pull things out, but your rods do. So we still want to use that same scan pattern. We really want to look off center in each of those segments. So you might do a 30-degree segment, and then another 30-degree segment with a 10-degree overlap, and then you move your way around as you're scanning at night. But as you're doing that, you're not looking directly for something. You're using the periphery of your vision. So if you're looking for traffic and someone says it's right off the wingtip, I don't look directly at the wingtip. I look a little ahead or a little behind, and then my rods typically have much better vision. And you can even see this at night. You're driving in your car at night, especially on a country road, and you see like a star off in the horizon. You could see them up on your peripheral vision, and then you look at it, and you'll notice it goes dim. And that's the fact that your rods are so much more sensitive to light than your cones, and so you want to use that off-center viewing. There is a problem with your rods, and that is that over time, about let's say 10 seconds, there's a chemical reaction that basically cancels out the light. They're very good at detecting things like movement, but once that light stays in position for a while, it will start to fade. So what that means is as you're scanning at night, you're using your off-center viewing, you kind of see something here, but if you just sit and let your eyes stay there, what happens is that light will fade and pretty soon you won't be able to see it anymore. But if you refocus and move your eyes just a little bit, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, that'll stay bright in your vision. And so when we're scanning at night, again, it's really important, to stay in an area for 2 to 3 seconds, but not to stare at it indefinitely, especially with off-center viewing because lights will begin to fade again. Okay. We'll take that now into the different illusions that we're going to see that are caused when we're flying at night. And we're going to start with the black hole illusion. And we're going to start by looking at, where are we here? Rock Springs, Colin?
This is Rock Springs. Yep.
Rock Springs, Wyoming. There's nothing but rocks in Rock Springs, Wyoming. If you've purchased our Takeoffs and Landings course, our crosswind videos are all filmed out of Rock Springs. You can see you're basically in the middle of a desert. And then after we did those crosswinds, we stayed and we filmed our night operations. And it is pitch black out there. There's really nothing. The city of Rock Springs is a tiny island of lights. And other than that, there's really nothing out there. So we'll go to the video and you can see, in this case here, we're turning final. And you really feel like you're sitting up on an aircraft carrier. You can see our lead-in lights running in. And we've got the lights turned up right here so the GoPros could pick them out. This is the airport area itself. But you have a very, very hard time finding a horizon in Rock Springs at night. And so in this case, if you're not comfortable flying on instruments, controlling the aircraft can become very, very, very difficult because you won't visually see a horizon. So one of the things I always tell people when you're evaluating where you're flying at night, number one, is there going to be moonlight? As a pilot, checking the moon forecast is, believe it or not, fairly important, especially over large rural areas. You get into New Mexico, Wyoming, Arizona, Nevada, western Minnesota, where I used to fly when I taught at UND. It's pitch black. Western North Dakota and Montana can be the same way. And so checking the moon forecast and saying, hey, am I going to have any moonlight? And then combining that with your clouds forecast and making sure that you're not going to have an overcast night where you can't see anything. Even though you may be in clear VFR with a 20,000 foot overcast layer, the reality is, as a VFR pilot, it could be very difficult to control the airplane if you don't have any natural light helping you illuminate the horizon. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Okay, next question is this, and it has to do with this dark runway. And it's this. Would love some tips for landing at night on runways with no PAPI or VASI. And also if there's any terrain on short final. One of the conversations here has been several people have trees that are in fairly close proximity to the runway, and there isn't necessarily a PAPI or a VASI at the airport.
Okay, so first of all, I've seen several of those airports. There's an airport, Kimmerer. It's got a couple extra R's. Kimmerer in Wyoming. It's got a ridge that you go over on your way into the airport. It's not lined up with a runway, but you fly over it, and it's deceivingly high. And the reality is, I always tell people, you need to be very, very careful operating into airports at night where you don't have clear view of the terrain and a PAPI to help you. I know a lot of small fields have trees have other items close to it, and they don't have a PAPI necessarily to guide you down. And the reality is, other than flying a steep approach, which is already difficult at night, guaranteeing you're going to clear those obstacles, it gets a little bit difficult. So one of the things I always tell people is be conservative about the airports you pick at night. I wish I could tell you a great technique to make sure you don't hit the trees, but if you read the safety reports, there's actually quite a few cases of pilots going into airports they know and don't know and finding leaves in their landing gear or seeing the trees and the landing lights when they thought that they were actually on glide slope. And so that can really create a problem. So again, I always tell people, if you don't really know the terrain, if you can't clearly see it, be careful about operating in there at night because it's easy to get confused and to find yourself close. Now, obviously a VASI or a PAPI, the other thing you need to check is a usable service volume, and you'll find that in the chart supplement. And that's because sometimes VASIs or PAPIs may be restricted to only a couple miles from the runway, or they may be restricted on one side of the runway. So before you trust it at night, you definitely want to take time, look at the chart supplement, and make sure that the usable service volume hasn't been kind of shortened or cut in. How about flying an approach in an airport without a VASI or PAPI? The key thing there is standard power settings. The shape of the runway and the angle will change, okay? If you think about it, longer runways, wider runways, it's gonna look a little bit different. So it's hard to use the shape of the runway and the angle alone to help you keep yourself right on glide path. But one of the things that I tell people is use your standard power settings. And if you take in our Takeoff and Landings course, we talk about this probably ad nauseum, super in depth, because I think the secret to a great landing is using standard power settings. So, maybe in a 172, you find that when you're abeam your touchdown point, you're gonna pull your power to, let's say, 1700 RPM. And then you'll leave it there as you descend and fly along the pattern. And so at night, when you don't have any visual references, there's a couple things that people tend to do. Number one, we don't like to descend. We're already kind of discombobulated and nervous, and so people tend to not want to descend. And the way we can tell is because they'll pull their power back to their normal abeam power setting, and then all of a sudden they'll start to get slow. And they're just they're pitching back and pitching back and pitching back to keep the airplane from descending. So again, one of the things that I say is fly your normal speeds and fly your normal power settings. And if you're really having a hard time, judging your descent angle, just start with that. Okay, my normal power setting, 1700 RPM. In the Cirrus, it's about 27 to 28% for us, 30% for some other people. So I just set that power setting. And then I fly my pattern speeds, 100, 90, then as I turn on to final, about 85. What I find is when I'm doing that, I'm almost perfectly lined up on glide path with the runway. Then from there, it's really about using the shape of the runway to help guide you in. And that just takes experience looking at that airport and kind of getting used to the shape of what a runway looks like. But the key thing I always tell people is standard power reductions and standard airspeeds. The most common errors that I see at night, we leave the power in, and then the other part, we end up very slow because unconsciously we're nervous and we're holding that yoke back, and now all of a sudden the airspeed's getting slow and the airplane is high, and we tend to roll out fairly high on final. I can tell you I find more pilots roll out high on final at night than roll out low. And that's just simply because we don't want to descend. And the interesting thing is we talk about the black hole effect. If you read in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, you'll read that when you have featureless terrain and a black hole where you have really no lights on the ground, that's featureless terrain, it tends to make you feel like you're very high. So visually, you can start to fly a lower approach. And I find that's true over the desert, over snow. If you're like, in Grand Forks where there's blowing snow and you really can't see anything, I find that to be true. At night, I feel like people tend to keep the power in and pitch back too much. They get slow, and that tends to keep them high. That black hole makes them afraid to descend. That's probably the best description I can give you for trying to keep that glide path controlled at night. And then from here, just kind of countering those illusions. And then, so the next illusion that can really screw you up at night is knowing the light's intensity. So if we go back here, you can see that we've got these runway lights turned on high. And if we were to bring them down to medium or low, what happens to the airport? It looks much further away. And so one of the big problems that we find when people click up 7 times to get those lights onto high intensity, they're super bright, and so you feel very, very close to the runway. And when you feel close to the runway, you tend to flare and fly a high approach. So what I will typically do on downwind is I'll bring the lights up to high. It helps me keep the runway in sight. I'm at altitude, easy to see. And then as I turn on to base, I'm going to spin them down to medium, or normally what I would prefer is low. One of the nice things about that is I can get the runway end identifier lights, the flashing white lights, to turn off. And I find that on final, those rails, the flashing white lights at the end of the runway, they can actually be kind of blinding as you start coming across the threshold. So I like those off when I'm flying on final. So that's a habit that I do in the pattern. If I'm flying patterns, as I'm on crosswind, I'll click up to 7, get the runway lit up like a Christmas tree. And then as I start my power reduction, or when I'm on base, I'll bring them down to 5 or 3 and keep those runway lights a little dimmer. For me, I'm
just going to hop in here quick. Could you specify what 5 or 3 means?
Oh, sure. Yeah, 5 clicks on the pilot-controlled lighting, or 3. So pilot-controlled lighting at airports, non-towered airports, or airports where the control tower is closed and not full-time lighted. As pilots, we can control the lights. So typically, you'll click 7 times on CTAF within 5 seconds to bring the lights up to high. That also typically activates the approach lighting system. 5 times to bring them down to medium, 3 times to bring them down to low. If the airport just has medium intensity lights, you could still do 7, they just don't get any brighter. And so typically when you go down to low, the approach lighting system or the rails will turn off. The rails are the flashing lights at the end. They'll turn off, which makes it easier to fly final. You don't have as many lights in your face, and that can cause you to flare high. And then the other thing is getting used to that. Once you're used to the lights at low intensity or at medium intensity and you're comfortable with that, that kind of helps you judge your flare height. One of the things, as you can see here, as we go back to the video, turning final, you can see in the distance back there, rails flashing. Okay, but as you turn final here, you have a very hard time seeing the horizon, and you can also have a very hard time judging your altitude. Now let's jump over to Rocky Mountain Metro, which is very different night flying. This is night in a heavy populated city. You've got lights everywhere. And so here you can see the runway as we turn final, and actually you can see both. That's 30 left, and that's 30 right. And as we line the aircraft up on final here, it's a little bit easier to judge our altitude. And that's because we've got all of these city lights kind of around us. So again, unless you're very comfortable flying into what I call kind of black hole airports, airports in the middle of nowhere, flying in on a moonless night or an overcast night can be very, very, very challenging. And avoiding terrain can be nearly impossible because you won't always see it. Okay. One of the things, though, that when you're flying in a city area or even the country, if you've got a highway or some housing lights out there, is they can always give you the false horizon effect. And that's where the lights themselves look like a horizon, but they're not actually the horizon. And I found this to be super true right around the mountains. So we'll take a look at the false horizon here. This is, again, in Denver as we're starting to turn from south through west. And if you look at the normal horizon, it's right here. That's the horizon. You can actually see it with those lights right here. But as we continue the turn, these lights right here start to create a false horizon. The challenge here is that in a false horizon, you may keep the aircraft in a bank angle or in a turn. And then to keep it going straight, you might start applying rudder pressure. So the key way to get rid of that false horizon effect is to cross-reference your flight instruments. Night flying is a little bit of instrument flying. And so you're cross-referencing your attitude indicator, you're cross-referencing your turn coordinator, and your heading indicator. You know, if you're in cruise flight and your heading indicator keeps turning and the only way you can stop it is by pushing on a rudder, chances are the aircraft is banking. So you want to use all of those together to try to help eliminate a false horizon. And here, as you look in this video, one of the problems you've got here, that false horizon is actually caused by the mountains. This is kind of the beginning of the front range. So you really wouldn't want to be that far over. But it could be anything. False horizon could be a highway. It could be just a string of lights down a section line. Especially in North Dakota, you would get something like that. It could be reflections on water on the ground. It could be all kinds of things that create a false horizon. And the only way you're really going to see it is to cross-reference against your attitude indicator, and then also cross-reference against your heading indicator and your turn coordinator. In fact, the only time I've ever had an attitude indicator fail was at night VFR, before I had my instrument rating. Once I got my instrument rating, I've never had an attitude indicator fail or a heading indicator fail. And so, you know, this is before I got my instrument training, but that attitude indicator rolled over at night, and then trying to control the airplane became more difficult. So that's why cross-referencing your heading indicator, your turn coordinator is important, even if you're not an instrument-rated pilot yet. Okay, the next item I want to talk about is autokinesis. And this is something that if you're flying out in the middle of nowhere and there's just one or two lights on the horizon, can really start to cause a problem. But let's take a look at it first. Basically, what happens is if you start to stare at a light, even if it's stationary, it'll start to move. So if you look at that light, that's what happens. It starts to move in your vision. Part of the problem here is you can start to think that you're looking at another airplane. So you might start maneuvering the aircraft away from it. You may try to turn to follow it. You might mistake it as traffic if ATC is giving you traffic to follow. Or you might try to keep the aircraft pointed at it, and so now you're banking or rolling to try to keep that point stationary. And this is why it's really important at night to never stare at anything, to keep that scan pattern moving. The best way to prevent autokinesis is to keep your eyes moving across the horizon. You know, about 30 degrees, maybe 10-degree overlap, moving every 2 to 3 seconds. That will prevent autokinesis. Autokinesis. The next one we've got can start to make you feel sick. And the reality is you oftentimes don't know why, but you'll start to feel just kind of nauseous or dizzy, or like you're off balance, maybe like your ears are off balance, and it's called flicker vertigo. Now, we've kind of emphasized the effect, but it's caused by your propeller. And as you can see us here, you can see these lights starting to flash as they pass into the propeller. At just the right flicker rate, that flicker vertigo can cause you to start to feel nauseous. And really, it happens at a rate that's fast enough that you really don't perceive the flickering. So, you know, we kind of exaggerated the flicker there. Usually, they look like they're steady lights, but they're just flickering slightly through the propeller if it's out in front of you. Probably won't happen in a twin, but in a single, this can happen. And so, if this happens, you'll usually pick it up because all of a sudden you're not feeling well. You know, you were feeling great before, and now you're feeling awful. And the best way to change that is to change the engine, or change the propeller's RPM. So on a fixed pitch airplane, just simply adjust the throttle a little bit. 100 RPM in either direction, maybe 50, it will solve the problem. If the airplane's got a controllable pitch propeller, just change the RPM on the propeller a little bit, and again, it should solve the problem pretty quickly. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, we got a whole bunch of questions. We're doing pretty good on time, so I think we'll be able to get through them. But the first one we're going to tackle is from Blake, and he wants to know, what's the best way to judge when to flare at night?
Okay, I think Colin might have timed that one carefully because
that may be possible.
We have the runway zoom and flare video coming in. I appreciate the softballs. So at night, part of the problem is you can't see the pavement. and that makes things a lot harder. You can't see the buildings as well either, so that also makes things a lot harder. And then finally, the problem is you just don't feel like the landing is normal, which really makes things harder. But there's a couple things that you can still use they're perfect in the day and they work at night. The two that I say is runway width zooming, okay, and judging the height of buildings. Hangars oftentimes have lights on them. They're usually illuminated. You can kind of see those out of your peripheral vision. But the runway zoom effect, I really tend to be able to see the most. And the beauty is, you've got your runway edge lights out there. They make a great reference. And so as we come in here, you can see that the width of the runway as we're descending is staying about the same. And then as we get down low, it quickly expands. So the runway kind of...
Play that in real time once.
Yeah. So the runway width staying about the same, and then you kind of notice it zooms out right there to fill the screen. And as it does that, we'll watch that one more time. That's when I start to land. And you can also see the Cirrus has fantastic runway light or landing lights. But you can also see at that same time, we can start to see the actual, I'm going to pause it here. You can start to see the pavement. It's hard to see in the video. Believe it or not, GoPros aren't fantastic at filming at night. But you can start to see the markings on the pavement showing up in the runway lights, or the landing lights. Typically, your landing lights will illuminate stripes well above your flare height. But as you start to get to flare height, the actual rubber on the road, like the landing marks made from tires and the concrete marks, that starts to show up. And so that's also a good indication, typically, as you're approaching flare height. One of the problems we find, especially with night landing, is point fixation. And that's because we start fixating on that landing light and fixating on the stripes in front of us, and we forget to look back up towards the end of the runway in flare. So oftentimes when night landings go wrong, everybody's like, yeah, the problem is I don't know when to flare. That's oftentimes true. As that runway starts to zoom, or you start to see not the white marks, but like the rubber marks on the pavement, that's a good hint. But as you do that, you want to remember to bring your eyes up and out along the horizon and start looking at, typically if you don't have an actual horizon line, the end of the runway. Use the end of the runway as kind of a pitch reference and bring that nose up to your landing pitch reference. That's part of the thing, as you're practicing night flying, learning kind of where the end of the runway should be in relation to your cowl as you're flaring and holding that flare attitude. That takes time and experience. But once you identify that, you see yourself, you start to see the runway marks come in, you see the runway start to zoom, bringing your eyes out, looking to the end of the runway, maintaining directional alignment that way, that allows you to flare. Otherwise, if you're focused on that landing light and you're just staring at the stripes, you really don't have any pitch reference. And that's why those landings tend to be a little nose low or very, very abrupt. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, Henry wants to know, do you start up the engine with the strobe lights on or off at night?
I don't turn my strobe lights on until I taxi onto the runway. And that's because we start engines in a hangar area that's already very brightly lit, and as soon as you turn those strobes on, they're white, so it's just reflecting light everywhere. And then we have white concrete that we're taxiing over on our way out to the runway, which again reflects back into the cockpit and destroys your night vision. So my strobes remain off until I'm cleared for takeoff, and then my strobes come on. If I'm at a non-towered airport with dark asphalt or towered with really dark asphalt and they're not reflecting into the cockpit, then I will leave the strobes on as I taxi. But when I'm dealing with light-colored concrete, I generally leave them off. There's too many lights going back into the cockpit, and it really can ruin your night vision. The other thing to mention with that is my landing light. I will taxi with the landing light on, but if I'm stopped and waiting in an intersection, I typically turn it off. If I'm turning where I'm going to point at another airplane, I will turn it off. That's just so I don't blind other pilots as they're taxiing by. Okay, next question.
Okay, Alex wants to know, can you review runway backtack? See if I can actually say this. Can you review runway backtaxing procedures at night?
Okay. Great question. You know, one of the things I always say is you don't have to worry as much if you don't hear other aircraft in the pattern. Keep in mind, someone could be on the wrong CTAF frequency. I've seen that happen many times. Or they're just not using their radios. I've seen that happen many times. So anytime we're operating on an airport, on an active runway, or any runway, I always assume there could be someone else in the pattern. Backtaxing at night, there's a couple things. Number one, I'm going to leave all of my lights on. And as I'm backtaxing, I'm going to move myself typically off-centered just a little bit because it kind of makes you a little bit more visible. Not much, though, because I don't want to end up taxiing off the side of the runway. And then the other thing that's a good idea to do is just make several CTAF calls if you have a long back taxi. You know, don't just make one as you start the back taxi, but make several, you know, maybe every minute or so as you're on the runway in case someone enters the pattern, and because the chances are it can be very, very difficult for them to see you. That being said, and I know most of us try to do this at all times, I really avoid back taxiing. If there's any way I can get on a taxiway, I'm going to go for it. And there are some airports where the taxiways won't take you to the takeoff point of the runway. You have to back taxi a little bit and turn around. I make sure before I'm on the runway to make sure my flaps are set, everything's ready to go so that I don't need to do a run up. I can just turn the airplane around, line myself up, take off, and go. The key thing is minimize your time there, make sure you're as visible as possible, and keep the CTAF frequency informed. Okay, next question.
Next question is this. Can you review how to identify pilot-controlled lighting times and schedules at part-time towered airports?
Okay, great question. So PCL lighting typically doesn't have a specific time listed with it. And so at a tower-controlled airport, the key thing is you're looking for when the tower is in operation. And so let's take a look. I'm going to jump into ForeFlight here. So a good example would be Rocky Mountain Metro. Airport facility directory is a great place. You know, one of the things I also tell people, if you're using ForeFlight, you can always kind of cheat because if you click on tower, they're going to tell you when it's in operation from 6 to 2200 local right there. But if you go to the airport facility directory at Rocky Mountain Metro, so right here, and I can't highlight this. I don't think I can draw on this. I'm just going to zoom in. Lighting. It's under the services section. So you'll see it says service right there. When tower closed, activate MIRL medium intensity runway lighting. Runway 321, runway 12 right and 30 left, and high intensity runway lighting 12 left, 30 right, plus the medium intensity approach lighting system with runway alignment lights for 30 right, the PAPIs for 321, 12 left, 12 right, 30 left, and 30 right, and the runway end identifier lights for 12 left, 12 right, and 30 left on CTAF. And then if you go down to the tower, you can see the tower is from 1300 to 5 Zulu. So again, it's an hour earlier. Colin, night is daylight savings time, right?
We're in daylight savings times right now.
Yeah.
And
so
it goes to standard time
yep.
here next month.
So 1300 to 5 Zulu, and that's where you find the tower. The other thing that people don't know is if you actually take a look at a chart, you'll see the asterisk next to the L. That means that lighting limitations exist. It does not necessarily mean that it's pilot-controlled lighting, but in most cases it is pilot-controlled lighting. And so that's a good place to check there. And then the star next to 118.6 means that the control tower is part-time. Okay, that looks like all the time we've got. We've got 6 minutes before we start Boldmethod Live IFR tonight. The IFR topics are 4 of our most commonly asked questions. We kind of get some really common questions about instrument procedures and operating. And so we've picked out 4 that we've been getting over and over and over again. We're going to go through those. It'll start in about 6 minutes. We have links in the bottom. Those links are to provide us feedback and to the following Boldmethod Live IFR. Again, the topic tonight was chosen off of feedback, and the questions in Boldmethod Live IFR were chosen off of feedback. So please give us our feedback, or give us your feedback. It really keeps these presentations rolling. If we don't see you for the IFR Live, we'll see you in 2 weeks for another Boldmethod Live VFR. Thanks, and good night.